Hello, everyone. So we're just letting a few more people come through and then we'll get going. So it'll be just a moment. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Creative Climate Chat. I'm Farah Ahmed from Julie's Bicycle, and today we are joined by Paul Dickinson from the Carbon Disclosure Project. So before we get going, we've got a little bit of housekeeping. The conversation today will be recorded, so your microphones and videos aren't switched on at the moment. If you have any questions, you'll see a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that for any questions you have throughout the session, and we'll get to those at the end. If you have any technical issues, please use the chat box and select all panelists. My colleague Ruby is with us today, and she'll be trying to solve any problems for you. If you have any resources or links to share, please also use the chat box. You can join in the conversation on social media using the hashtag #CreativeClimateChat. And please do remember to tag Julie's Bicycle @CDP and @GlobalOptimism. And finally, we are fully booked, so we're live streaming today's session on YouTube. Ruby will share the link in the chat box with you. Please feel free to share that with others and bring them into the conversation. So before we crack on, we do have a little poll that we would like to share with you all. Let's get this up. And we're just wanting to find out how the current COVID-19 pause has impacted you or your organization's commitment to creative climate action. So we'll give you a couple of seconds to get that through. So your options are galvanized to do more, already very active on this issue, taking this moment to start thinking about it for the first time, or any creative climate action has been paused due to COVID-19. Okay, just a few more seconds. And we'll end it there. Okay, so I'm going to hand over now to Alison Tickell, who is the director of Julie's Bicycle, and she'll be in conversation with Paul.
Thank you, Farah. Thanks, everybody. Welcome again for everybody who's joining us, and also welcome to Paul. So this is the third of our Creative Climate Chats. We've another full house, and we have great pleasure in hearing from Paul Dickinson, who founded Carbon Disclosure Project in 2000, which has since become a really important force for corporate good. But before that, for newcomers, a quick introduction to the chats, and for veterans, apologies for any repetition. So these conversations are where we meet exceptional people from climate or from culture, occasionally from both, doing exceptional things to change the world for the better. Today, we're looking at something that many of you who work with us are used to doing, a chore for some, but for us at Julie's Bicycle, a real joy, helping you to gather your environmental data that we can use to be accountable, to drive change, to learn, to be there in the world in a different way. And we really need this. We know that the climate crisis is the consequence of an insatiable and deeply irresponsible exploitation of fossil fuels, irresponsible because our governments and fossil fuel producers have known this for decades. Climate change, the climate science really isn't new. We know that we're way off track to meet the targets that we need to meet. The UK has legally binding targets, and we have 5 yearly carbon budgets to which we are accountable. We know that we're not meeting them, particularly the 4th and the 5th, which are 2023 onwards, and they're really important because they are going to be our flagship moments for our net zero target in 2050. This is all about living in a safe world. And we also know that tackling the climate crisis is only possible if we tackle much deeper systemic shifts in our values. And therein lies the responsibility of the arts and culture. Our several immediate crises in the UK include the economic crisis. Today, there was some truly really deeply disturbing forecasts from the Creative Industries Federation and Oxford Economics around the forecasts for the arts and culture. This is going to be really tough. Job losses of perhaps 400,000, and that's really going to be hard. We also have a persistent and obstinate failure to get to grips with ingrained racism, and that this has been so shockingly exposed since May the 25th, and of course the climate and the nature crisis with severe consequences for frontline communities and even more perilous ones on the horizon. As I said last week, all these crises are so closely bound together, they're intimately connected. Extractive growth to benefit a small number of economies and people at horrific cost. So rescue and recovery from this point are very different. And Julie's Bicycle's written to our Secretary of State for Culture to support a just and a green recovery and to ensure that the Cultural Renewal Task Force hardwires climate and climate justice and our legal and our moral obligations for a safe world in the run-up to the climate talks in November 2021. Many of you might have signed JB lobbying letters in the past, but we'd love you to sign this one too. Because at the heart of it is the convergence of these 3 imperatives: the Green Deal, a Green New Deal, a net zero emissions economy, and of course, a just transition, climate action that generates positive social impact. So many of you are doing fantastic work in this area, monitoring your emissions, bringing down your impacts, all sorts of incredible responses, both creative and practical, advocating for climate change and putting in place the governance, operations and programs around creative climate action that really are going to make the difference. And some of you will be doing science-based target frameworks with us, pathways to net zero companies. So you'll not be surprised. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Paul Dickinson to our Creative Climate Chats. 2 weeks ago, we had the inspirational Lucy Davis from the Royal Court, the heart of creative practice in a theatre. Yes, last week we had Chaitanya Kumar from the New Economics Foundation, who's talking about climate justice in the context of energy policy and the importance of building solutions based on community and grassroots knowledge. And Paul comes from the corporate field. It's another world entirely, but one that we would be really wise to understand well. Paul founded CDP in 2000 and now represents over 650 investors with assets that are really mind-boggling. $97 trillion. I think that's right, Paul. It's a mind-boggling number, and CDP uses this authority to persuade companies, cities to report on their greenhouse gas emissions, and as well as strategy on climate change and water use and deforestation, etc. The aggregate number of people, inhabitants represented is around 1 billion. Again, that's a mind-boggling number. But Paul is also chair of the trustees of the NGO Share Action, which many of you might know of, a really terrific organisation looking at finance and assets and how to reform the finance sector, a trustee of the Findhorn Foundation, and a co-presenter of the podcast that, if you haven't listened to, I can't recommend it highly enough, Outrage and Optimism, with Christiana Figueres and Tom Carnac. There, it's a really, really entertaining, fun, informative, great podcast. So, Paul, slightly long introduction, but let's get cracking with the conversation. So I'm going to start with, Paul and I had a chat yesterday, and I'm going to start where we left off. Tell us how you got here and what was your particular road to Damascus?
So I think that the road to Damascus, how can I put it, 2 parts. One is that when I was about 20, which was 36 years ago, I thought that I'd love to be in politics somehow, because it struck me the world was kind of badly organized. I did a little bit of campaigning on lesbian and gay equality in 88, 89 as a volunteer for the Stonewall Lobby Group, but it was 1988 that I had a second kind of epiphany, and that was that actually, if I wanted to pursue a political career, so to say, that corporations were taking over from governments. I was working in an annual report design company, and I was looking at these reports that these huge corporations produce, and I thought, crikey, actually, their power's growing. National governments are kind of going to diminish in power. But then I kind of worked in corporate communications, trying to learn how corporations worked. But then some of you will have heard of Anita Roddick, who founded The Body Shop, a very brilliant leader. And she set up a kind of master's course in responsibility and business practice, which I went on in 97. And there I met an ecologist who worked with James Lovelock, and I was told about climate change. And so it kind of rattled around my brain for a couple of years. But then basically in the year 2000, I thought, right, that's it. I'm going to spend the rest of my life working on climate change with corporations.
Terrific. I mean, that's already really interesting that we've got this global governance framework that has assigned largely to the United Nations the job of setting the frameworks for climate action. And of course, within that, where is the place for the corporates?
I mean, one of the things, it's great, so good to be with the wonderful people here today. We talked yesterday about the fact that I think it's really important that we recognize corporations are cultural actors. But I also believe that despite the fact they have like boards of directors and very, grown-up sounding people running them, institutionally, they're almost like children. They're like infants. Unlike national governments, which have over thousands of years developed formats for what you could describe as the public interest, all anyone has ever said to corporations is make us as much money as possible. Just go and make us money. And that was sort of all right when governments were kind of strong enough to govern the corporations. But with each passing decade since about 1970 or even earlier, some would say it was 100 years ago, the corporations have got better and better at sort of managing governments. But they're not managing governments like in a James Bond movie, where they've got some plan. They're just managing governments to get the hell out the way, right? And then they just apply technology and money and they just do what they do. And I think that what we have to do in the climate crisis is recognize that, boy, there's a lot of force and power and energy in these corporations. And we've got a responsibility to sort of help them evolve some kind of capability to understand what's going on.
So at the heart of that is a really broken governance system. That takes out of governance frameworks and accountability frameworks some of the most powerful drivers of, well, perhaps the most powerful drivers in our global economy, whose legal responsibility is to make money at all costs. So that is a huge problem. Tell me how you have solved it, both within CDP, but also what you feel is missing.
Well, yeah, I've definitely solved it, so we can all relax. The northern ice cap is refreezing. We're in a great. No, I certainly haven't solved it at all. One of the things I would observe is when you're dealing with the global business system, it's really big. So with a lady called Tessa Tennant, we started this organization CDP back in 2001, basically. And what we've been doing for 17 years now is we've been representing ever larger groups of investors once a year. We're actually a charity, a UK charity. We operate globally as a not-for-profit, but we've been representing investors and getting companies to kind of report on their performance, because there is a saying in the kind of environmental movement that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So for example, I mean, you can actually go to our website, cdp.net, and I think you can download at least 20 responses for free. I remember I was working with some animal rights people and downloaded the McDonald's response in my hotel room that evening. And I looked up McDonald's, so to say, scope 3, which is their purchases. Their purchases, basically meat and potatoes, to be honest with you. And the emissions from their purchases are bigger than British Airways, which also owns Iberian Airlines and Aer Lingus or something. So, you can discover from CDP that McDonald's purchasing beef is bigger than the third largest airline in the world. And we need to understand these figures to be able to change our behavior. I mean, in our podcast, we interviewed a chap called Ethan Brown, I think, and he'd founded a company called Beyond Meat in 2009. And to be honest with you, they've made a beef burger out of plants that tastes better than a beef burger made out of beef. So, there's all sorts of, I think we need information to work out where the problems are, and then we need innovation to change. But to the audience today, cultural innovation is the most important kind.
Tell me why you feel that is the case.
Well, we had on the podcast, my co-host Christiana Figueres is on holiday. So we had a chap called Kumi Nadu on, who used to run Greenpeace and then also ran Amnesty International. And he said that he agrees with this Steve Bannon chap. Now, I don't think many people are fans of Steve Bannon. He's kind of, very questionable human in some of his attitudes. But Bannon said culture leads politics, and I'm sure that's true. And I was talking about how I've been very struck in the recent standoff between demonstrators and the police in the United States. One of the most positive things I'd seen was demonstrators in Los Angeles, Miami, Washington, even the head of the New York Police Department going down on one knee with the demonstrators. Even the National Guard were persuaded by a very energetic young demonstrator to go down on one knee. You can trace this back to Colin Kaepernick, who in August 2016 went down on one knee during the US national anthem and created a sort of meme that changed the world. Look at Greta Thunberg. She strikes as a child, then millions of children start striking. And I've got to tell you, it ain't cool. I'm not a parent, but plenty of people I know who are parents are kind of like, it's not that cool. My children are on strike because I'm destroying their future. It's a bit in your face, and we need more in your face activism.
Okay, so tell me how you interpret activism in the corporate context.
Yeah, great question, and I haven't got any kind of good answer at all. I mean, activism is a very funny word. It means sort of trying to change things. It's funny, if you go and if you're a big oil company and you get a couple of $1 billion and you build some giant steel structure and then you tow out into the middle of the sea and then you drill into the Earth's crust and start pumping up oil, that's not activism. But if you kind of represent some shareholders or something in a letter and you say to the chair of the board, we're a little bit worried about human survival, could you tell us what you think about it? That's called activism. So I think that the subtle activism, but the most effective kind of activism is something that we all can own. One thing I think is very important is in my years in climate change, every time I try and kind of point the finger at people, I find it comes quite quickly back at me. And I'm like, oh, you know, oil companies are drug dealers and we're the addicts. So we need to recognize that. We need to see our role in the system. But I think that the opportunity for culture to change the spirit of things, you know, people will tell you, for example, that your pension fund or something has to invest to make as much money as possible. That's their legal duty. Nothing else matters. And that's kind of true. But actually, the law says that they're supposed to invest in your best interests. Now, a few years ago, we sort of said as a society that we didn't think child labor was okay. And we sort of started selling companies that were associated with, I could phone up the boss of my pension fund and say to her or him, I'm not very impressed that you sold those companies that had child labor. They were performing rather well. But I think I'd be the one who looks stupid. And I think that's the role of culture, is to work out who looks stupid, because the you know, politics and the law follows those leads, I would say. And
one of the interesting comments made by one of our board members, Farhana Yamin, has been a relentless questioning of this idea of limited liability and how that creates huge problems when it comes to accountability and it comes to the assignation of responsibility in the corporate space. It's a very interesting idea, something I think we should spend, or collectively, I'm not a lawyer, but it feels like it could be a really important, a very similar kind of intervention as the one that compels corporates to make money at all costs. And one that seems to be increasingly, there are some clashes of corporate interest in terms of governance. If it is, as you say, it's in best interest, it is also now a legislative requirement to meet our carbon targets. But it is also in a context in which limited liability and corporate interests are still very prevalent. So it's a really interesting sort of context in which this is now, we're now rehearsing a future. And of course, Paul, again, back to Carbon Disclosure Project. Have you found that since the sort of revival of interest in and the deeply felt, I think probably since 20, I mean, I think Greta's done amazing stuff, but for me, the pivotal moment was the 2018 IPCC special report on climate, which gave us that extraordinary idea that we had 12 years left in which to create the frameworks for climate action. Since that time, how has it felt for you? How do you feel that there are big changes in the corporate sector, and are they asking the right questions?
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are changes. I think it's wrong to necessarily imagine that there's a higher degree of sort of competence there. You know, on the one hand, corporations have the most massive power and they do spend large amounts of money trying to kind of influence the political process. But on the other hand, they are also just like growing towards what's profitable and in the interests of their customers and their shareholders. So they're sort of a contested space, if you will. I think that the Extinction Rebellion, I think Greta really has helped. I think extreme weather, unfortunately, is a great big advertisement for climate change. And, you know, there is an old saying that when something's true in reality, it must be true in theory. And we've been having a bit of that happening, if you know what I mean. I mean, the truth is, if I mention COVID-19, for example, we all know how COVID-19 seems to have changed the whole world in the last 100 days beyond all recognition. actually, if you look back over, from 2100 backwards, I think COVID-19 in the year 2020 will look extremely small. And I think climate change will look horrifically big. I feel that the people in 2100 would like to come back here now in a time machine and scream at us like, what were you thinking? But there is a gift with COVID-19, which is a recognition that we are vulnerable, and that actually investment in changing behavior now can have massive positive results. So I think all of that comes together and makes me very excited.
Great. Yes, I would agree. Can I just ask you a slightly challenging question, which is obviously you know CDP is obliged to work with many of the organizations that actually are at the heart of the problem. Do you feel that perhaps your executive leadership team, do you feel comfortable in challenging them?
Yeah, 100%. In a sense, myself and my colleagues, about 400 of us around the world, we are kind of irrelevant. What we do is we represent, 650 investors. Actually, I think it's $104 trillion. Once a year, formally, legally, we represent it. So the 8,500 corporations that report through us, they're not kind of reporting to us, they're reporting to their investors through us. We also have a program where we represent customers, purchasing organizations, about 150 really big companies who spend about $4 trillion a year buying things. And we get information from their suppliers. So ultimately, we're not challenging business. What we are doing is having investors and business challenge business. And that, we can feel very relaxed about that because, frankly, business is, for all its flaws, it's highly technologically advanced, it's based upon high degrees of logic, and information is at the heart of business decision making. So it's a bit sort of geeky what we do, which is getting accountability on environmental performance. But I think it's extremely important because there is a saying that what gets measured gets managed. Bill Clinton spoke at one of our launch events. He said, you've got to keep score.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple of quick questions, and for any listeners, do send your questions in. Current events, both COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, have really opened up, they've cracked open the conversation about inequality, about climate justice, about systemic racism. To what extent do you think that the environmental movement has been guilty, perhaps, that's a very emotive word, but culpable in not acknowledging some of these realities in the past?
Well, I'd divide that question into two parts. So if we talk about the degree to which the environmental movement, NGOs like the one I work in, and other comparable NGOs and other organizations are sort of overstaffed by white people particularly, yes, it's a systemic problem. I think the environmental movement reflects exactly the systemic racism that runs throughout, the kind of advanced economies. I think in terms of the impact of our work, I'm not drawn to work on climate change because of the racial profile of people who are going to be basically killed by climate change or have their lives destroyed. It happens to be the case, however, that the people who are going to be killed or are being killed or having their life destroyed are primarily kind of non-white people. The nations most in danger are in the continent of Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. That's where really we're seeing already horrific loss of life. So there is definitely a racial dimension to just full-blown climate change.
So it's really about climate justice. Do you think that the climate justice movement, which we know that more environmental campaigners are killed than any other campaign issue, but very often they are under the radar because they're in the global south. do you think what more can we do to make sure that we are surfacing these stories and making sure that those voices are properly heard?
Yeah, I mean, I've given a lot of thought to that exact question. And I'm going to come in it with a rather odd and slightly unpleasant analogy. But many people on this call will be familiar with Jimmy Savile, the TV presenter. And I think, he's most famous now for appearing to have been a kind of serial sex offender against, practically everyone he was working with and the audiences. It's just, now we're looking back and going like, what was going on? Now, it appears to have been quite a bit of a kind of cover up at the time, and no one was going to speak out, and, just very bad behavior. I wonder if we'd gone back in time and said, well, look, we can't call out Jimmy Savile, but what if we talked to the BBC director, said, do you think you're insured if he's molesting people? What if we said to the TV companies or whatever, what if we went to the insurance companies and said, if a presenter is molesting people, are you insuring them, the directors of the company, from liability? Maybe it wouldn't change anything, but it would be a rather acute way of raising the sort of the information to be in the face. This is what we have to do. So I would say we need to recognize that there's probably nothing so vulnerable and so cared for as a brand. Great brands like Coca-Cola or BMW, people go to incredible lengths to protect these brands. Microsoft. If those brands are involved with misdeeds, and I've seen a brilliant Greenpeace attack on the Kit Kat brand, where a video was made about palm oil in Kit Kat. That's a cultural contribution that fundamentally changed Kit Kat, the Nestle, I think it was Nestle, fundamentally changed them very, very quickly. So my answer is really, we need to be creative, which is why I'm so pleased to be with your audience today. The creative industries actually have the power to change public perceptions of corporate behavior far more effectively in some ways than the sort of systems that I operate.
There's a challenge for us. There are two questions. The first is describes itself. It's by Malik. Hello, Malik. You've got two questions there, so we'll answer them both. Malik Jeng. Is a devil's advocate question. If the campaign on meat consumption for climate change is mainly centered on the increase of the amount of land needed to rear more cattle, why is it difficult to plant more trees to replace those fallen, especially considering a lot of reserved land abounds?
Well, I mean, back to Ethan Brown of Beyond Meat, he talked about how he believes that if and when, I would argue, his company and companies like his take out meat production from animals, they can liberate something like 93% of farmland. Now, just think about that for a minute. 93% of farmland no longer used for farming because we feed the whole world on 7% of the farmland we currently use. That's the going away from meat bonus. And the separate part of your question is, can we cover all of that land with trees? Well, yes, we can, but you probably know as much about that as I do. It's a job to be done. It
also isn't without its own sort of time issues, is it? The amount of it's the pragmatism around the time it takes for trees to sequester carbon. Another question from Malik, and it's a great question. How does climate change affect the global south particularly?
Yeah, I mean, it is, I would say, the greatest disaster of all for the global south, because one of the things that's so disturbing about the north, if you will, is that we just spend money to deal with the problems. I was on a holiday in Valencia, I think probably a really long time ago, maybe 10 years ago or something like that, 8 years ago. And there were ships going from Barcelona to Valencia with water because Valencia didn't have any water. But Spain's a big, rich country, and they just hire ships, fill them with water. What if you haven't got enough money to hire ships or build pipelines? What happens then? I tell you what happens. You've got no water. You've got no water. It's kind of it. So the global south is, I met, or I saw actually on YouTube, a filmmaker in a theater. Actually, she's academic, but she went to Bangladesh and she worked with Bangladeshi families. Many of them are on the delta, and the water rises, and many of them live in properties that are or homes that are lifted up because of the water rising constantly. You know, the seawater ingress. And the play was really about how you have to tie the baby up at night, because if your baby is not tied up at night and it walks and falls into the water, the baby's gone. And so, you know, this just sort of starts to bring home to me, you know, the people in the north worry a little bit about climate change because they have to get a bigger air conditioner. I mean, it's just not funny for the south. It's unbelievably serious and terrifying. But one thing I just want to throw in the mix is that this Green New Deal concept, which is at the heart of what everyone's talking about at the moment, I started off thinking it was some kind of argument between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Fox News. And then I realized something we're going to have to do ourselves every day in every decision.
Absolutely. Just quickly, yeah, completely. And I'd like to just pursue that. But Malik, I just, my own sort of thought as well, to add to Paul's, is also that, you know, one of the issues around dealing with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, actually, which is as alarming, is as much to do with colonialist history and the need to really take a full frontal look at how we've got to this moment where we have ravaged, I say we, I mean white Europeans have ravaged so much of the world, and there is something to do with a great reckoning that we do need to take on around that. Which is to accept responsibility, reparations, and then look to recovery and regeneration. And I think it's very hard to talk about climate increasingly in this last, this real spotlight on Black Lives Matter, and this is critical for culture as a shaper of values, as a sort of presenter of the world in a different way. This critical responsibility we have to look into the heart of the climate crisis and understand its causes and its consequences, and take on the what will be a tremendous role of responsibility in order to take this forward. This business about the Green New Deal, John, I'm really glad that you brought it up, Paul. We are really excited by the idea of a Green New Deal. It's a pity that in this country we haven't got the same kind of momentum as we've got in Europe. Tell us what you feel briefly the opportunities for the Green New Deal are.
Well, I mean, you know, our economies are somewhat crushed at the moment by just massive concentrations of wealth. You know, was it Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos from Amazon? Those three individuals have wealth equivalent to half US citizens. So although I know that Warren Buffett says he likes his Coca-Cola and I'm sure Bill Gates likes his iPhone or something, you know, three individuals can't consume like 170 million individuals can consume. So we've got ourselves into a ridiculous situation where wealth is just absurdly concentrated and there's sort of misery for hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Well, parking that for a minute, what we really need is to insulate all our homes in the colder countries. We need to put fiber optic cable everywhere. We need to start completely changing our agriculture from meat to, there are infinity jobs. We need to decarbonize the energy system. There are infinity jobs. And all you've got to do is just believe in it and do it and everything will be great. The problem, the only problem is that existing industries existing cash flows protect themselves. I did meet a Harvard professor and the IMF, the Independent Monetary Fund, had said that fossil fuel industry gets $500 billion a year in subsidies from governments. And this Harvard professor said, so they would spend up to $3.5 trillion to defend those subsidies. So the amount of money that's getting spent, and I'll just give you one example. The Koch brothers in the US are often identified as heavy spenders on campaigns to reduce the Green New Deal, to stop that kind of thing, because they run oil companies. And I was a big climate mask in 2016, and there were lots of people there demonstrating and dressed as dinosaurs. And I said to them, why don't you go up to Columbus Circle, because there's the ballet up there and it's funded by the Koch brothers. And why don't you stand there at the ticket office and say, you shouldn't buy tickets for something funded by, I mean, some of the campaigns against fossil fuels in the arts have been super critical. Look at BP, it just wrote down 18 billion of assets. I think that's because the kind of people on this Zoom call made decisions about what was and was not acceptable. So I kind of just back to this point about the extraordinary power that exists, because, you know, nobody really cares about petrol. You know, when you're driving along in your car, you don't care if you put BP petrol in or you put, you know, Exxon petrol in, and people aren't really thinking about that. But, you know, the Tate Gallery is the most important, one of the most important cultural institutions in the United Kingdom. And people think about the Tate Gallery makes the news. I mean, when Ai Weiwei was imprisoned, it said release Ai Weiwei across the top of the Tate Gallery, and the premier, or the Chinese premier, was coming to the UK, and he got freed.
Yes, a great responsibility that we have, but one that we are increasingly as a community, I think, really beginning to get very excited by, which is terrific. I've got one more question, and then I think we're going to have to start to finish. It's a quick question, and if we haven't got time, we'll just we'll answer by email. Is there evidence to suggest carbon reporting by companies, this is by Andrew Land, affects consumer behavior? That's one question. And if a company can demonstrate real success in this area, does it translate into commercial success? Thank you, Andrew Land.
So great question. I'd say there's two parts to that question. The first one, does carbon reporting affect consumer behavior? I have a friend called John, and he tells me that I must never ever call people consumers, because he says that consumers will behave like consumers, but if you call them citizens, they might be capable of anything, right? But does carbon reporting affect citizen buying behavior? And the answer, I think, is not yet, but it could do. So we need to use carbon reporting. We need to produce we need to interpret data. So, you know, when I talked about that McDonald's example and British Airways, that was me trying to use that data to say to people on this call, have you any idea what the emissions are in your beef burgers? So I think that's a work in progress. We've managed to get all the corporations kind of to account for their carbon. They do now. So we need to process that. I mean, Unilever this week said that they're going to put a carbon label on every single product. I will put a call out to something I'm not involved with financially. I'm not paid by them, but they're called Geeky, G-I-K-I. That reads 250,000 barcodes and will tell you the carbon footprint, you know, and the quality of products. Wonderful thing, Geeky. So the final part of the question, can it connect to profits? Well, I go back to...
It's going to have to be a yes or a no, or an ish.
Yeah, 100%. If you have the solution, once again, look at that company Beyond Meat. They make plants into burgers. They're worth 8 billion.
Terrific. That's great. Sorry we had to hurry it, but we can always continue it afterwards. I'd love to mine you for some of your stats. The last thing to say is just for all of you who haven't read our letter that we sent to Oliver Dowden, we sent to the Secretary for Education, we sent to Alok Sharma, who's the president of COP and BAYS, and also we sent to DEFRA. Please do read it if you agree with what we're asking for, which is a green cultural renewal, and with the just transition right in the heart of it and various other things. We'd love you to join us in signing it. Thank you, Paul, for a really stimulating, far too short 40 minutes. We could do it double. If people have got questions before I hand over to Farah, just send them in and we will endeavour to answer them, and Paul has kindly offered to answer them too. So thank you all very much, and I'm just going to end with Farah. Paul, brilliant. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Alison and Paul. And so as we wrap up, I just want to share the results of the poll that we did at the start of the session. So you can see 68% of attendees here have been galvanized to do more since Corona lockdown started. We've got 20% who are already very active on creative climate action, 4% who are taking this moment to start thinking about it for the first time, and 8% who have paused all creative climate action because of COVID-19. So those are really interesting results, and they'll help us to shape the kind of conversations and resources that we are sharing in the future. Sorry about that, it's the sounds of South London out there. So the next steps are you are very welcome to keep the conversation going using the hashtag Creative Climate Chat and any social media. You can sign up to our bulletin to stay in touch with future news and events. So it's full of resources and really inspiring stories and voices. Last week we did a whole bulletin on climate justice, which is really linking it back to all of these conversations that we've had about extraction and colonialism and racial justice. So there'll be a link going around in a few days. Please endorse our letter to the government calling for a just, fair and green cultural recovery. So we'll send that link around, but you'll also find it on our website, www.juliesbicycle.com. Please sign up to the next 2 Creative Climate Chats. So we've got one next week at the same time with Raj Pal, who is from Colonial Countryside, and that's about uncovering the histories of land and artifacts and how it relates to our current understanding of the British countryside. And on the week after that, we've got Zamzam Ibrahim, who is president of Students Organising for Sustainability. And she'll be talking about her work mobilizing students in the UK on climate justice. Please join the season. So we are launching a series of artworks and creative programming in the lead up to COP26 next year. So you'll find out more on seasonforchange.org.uk. And we'll be sending around a really quick anonymous survey afterwards to help us improve these sessions. So please help us out by taking a minute to complete this. If you have any specific feedback or questions you'd like us to respond to, please drop your email into the chat box here and we'll try and get back to you soon. And we're going to keep the chat function open for the next 15 minutes to leave space for people to exchange thoughts and share feedback and resources, which we'll collect and send around along with the recording in the next few days. So if you'd like to be a part of that, please just stick around. And that's it from us. I hope that we see you all again next week and for future sessions. So thank you once again to Alison, to Paul, to Ruby, who's been behind the scenes, and to everyone who's joined us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.